Asunder. After the War of the Worlds. For more information, please visit servingworlds.com. Written and performed by John Mira. April 4th, 1896. Folkestone Harbor, Great Britain. Marcus Riggs was no soldier. A black man, living just 2 decades past the Civil War, stayed away from anything with too many rules. And Marcus was happy bending the ones that went out of their way to follow him. That was why Marcus had moved north and made a home for himself in the wilds of Nova Scotia, and it was why he and his first mate were now outfitting their ship, trapped in a British harbor, with something that definitely bent all the rules. He watched that first mate fasten down something borrowed from their hosts, something covered in sailcloth to avoid prying eyes on the neighboring ships that they'd spent months moored alongside. No one did take an interest, Marcus's furtive glances told him, and he gave silent thanks. They can see my boxers when they're hanging from the deck to dry, he thought, but they sure as shooting better not see this. It was a pleasant, lazy afternoon, despite the journey the two men were about to make. It felt more like late May than early April, though, Marcus thought, and he put it down to all the rocks falling from the sky, stirring up dust and temperature. He pushed back the brim of his black fisherman's cap, closed his eyes, and savored the salty breeze from offshore. It was a rare, mostly clear day. Not many of those since the Blitz started, Marcus thought, as he took another bite of his apple. An Allington pippin it was, and he was always amazed by its pineapple-like flavor. He'd laid in a few bushels of them for the crossing, in fact. His best friend and Pegasus' first mate, Hobe Martin, roared at the spanner, eking an extra quarter turn of the bolt, then rocked back on his knees. "Phew! You want a turn?" Marcus shook his head and took another big bite, wiping at the juice running down his chin. Hobe glared up at him, but his face quickly turned thoughtful. "You think they'll be able to do it? You know, actually—" He whistled and made a corkscrew motion with his hand, raising it skyward. "No talking about that," Marcus said, and whipped his apple core out into the harbor. "Or did you already forget the on pain of death bit of the speech?" Hobe lifted one end of the sailcloth and pointed at the 3 thin tubes of the business end. "You're okay swiping this, but I can't talk about the other." "About the size of it," Marcus said, and tugged the cloth back down over the iridescent green and purple metal of the barrels. Hobe shrugged. "Guess the whole world will know if it was a success soon enough." "Or we'll raise a glass to our friends from Folkestone," Marcus said quietly, and hoped they went easy. Both were quiet after that. It had been a year of hard things, though, and it had taught them not to hold on to gloom. The sun warmed Marcus's back. The sky had shed most of its usual gray-brown for something very close to blue, and he was that very day sailing for home. He let himself hope. Never mind. We're going back," Hobe said, echoing his thoughts, and turned the heavy spanner over the last bolt of the tripod mount, stretching below the cloth-covered apparatus. Marcus watched his wiry, some would say skinny, engineer put his back into the work. Hobe may have been small, but he was stronger than he looked. Pushing around sails and steam turbines did that to a man. As he held the something borrowed in place for his engineer to finish bolting down, Marcus wondered again why the Blitz had slowed in recent days. Had Dr. Grace been right about the fate of the monstrous creatures behind the shower of rock from the sky? Hobe grunted as he turned the bolt. Damn Navy rats, clipping the wings of our Pegasus. And damn Colonel What's-His-Name for keeping us in harbor. Barton's not such a bad sort, Marcus said. He saw us for the dashing scientists we are and put us to work, didn't he? True enough. After the invasion, and finding himself trapped in port, Marcus had little expectation of hospitality. Even in a Britain working to break the back of the slave trade, day-to-day living still saw most black men shining shoes and shoveling coal in the mighty British Empire. Still, finding Pegasus the unwilling guest of Her Majesty Victoria also hadn't been as hard a shock as it might have been. Everyone had been otherwise occupied fighting giant metal machines to worry much about the course of civil liberties. Marcus and Hobe had taken it upon themselves to pitch in straight away and forage for supplies even before the last telegraphs to arrive told of the destruction being wrought on the cities all over the world. And it was the end of the world, as far as anyone knew. The end of the empire and the reign of man, at the very least. Marcus and Hobe were survivors, though. They worked hard, and soon found themselves promoted by dint of surviving attacks by walking machines and impossible flying ships. "My work's what got me 3 squares, Cap. It didn't get me any invite to dinner with the officers," Hobe said, as he sunk another bolt deep into the deck. And Marcus made a face. Of course he hadn't been invited to any dinners either, not even after he'd improvised a bomb out of Folkestone's kerosene reserves and brought down one of the walking machines. Colonel Barton had requested his talents taking it apart, and more of the captured machines, and on defending the town even, before army reinforcements began to rally at Folkestone, and as often as not put Marcus's ideas into action themselves. Soon after the first ships from India arrived with soldiers, Marcus and Hobe were promoted to work in the mouse hole. Ah, the mouse hole. That was all past now, Marcus thought, and sighed deep. He closed his eyes to feel the sway of the Pegasus beneath him. He loved having her under him again. Pegasus was a small ship for an ocean-goer, barely kept seaworthy with spit, bailing wire, and 2 sharp men's know-how and prayer. But it was their home away, and both men loved her. Working in the mouse hole, for all its wonders, had made them nervous to be so far away from their boat. Hobe wasn't the only one who'd gotten his blood up when the Admiralty had closed the ports and seized all ships in name of the newly formed Allies' war effort, but Marcus understood it, and he'd have done the same, most like. And he had been enthralled by the work, no lie, especially when the turn came, and flyers and walkers started crashing down in the streets and fields, the creatures inside dead or dying. He remembered the first time he'd seen the strange armored form of an invader. Soon after, masses of invaders began dying in the streets, the surviving metal walkers and ships pulling back into London, the tatters of Queen Victoria's army following. That army collected what they could from the work in Folkestone, or rather deep under Folkestone, and put every hand to the task of reclaiming strange devices and puzzling loose the secrets of how they worked. That meant another promotion for Marcus to full-time assistant to Dr. Grace, as the army gathered its strength for a full siege of London. If only they'd been successful in taking the city once the invaders had left. "It's done," Hobe declared, drawing Marcus back to the here and now to see his engineer put his weight against the mount and watch it stand fast. "First-rate engineer," Marcus teased and ruffled Hobe's scruffy blonde locks. Hobe grinned and slapped the hand away. "Then give me a raise." Marcus waved around at the Pegasus. "You already own half." Behind Hobe, across the harbor, were the wooden blocks and half-complete skeletons of ships on the shore. Marcus's smile died when he saw them. He loved the sea and the ships that sailed her, and he wondered when boat-building would begin here again. At least here, women and children still worked hard to keep the place up. It was a beautiful town, Folkestone, despite more than a year of occupation and resistance. He wondered how Dr. Grace would get on without him. It hadn't been so bad. Marcus liked the doctor, and knew Hobe did too, despite his protests. The good and strange doctor had puzzled out how the invaders communicated through the ether, and mastered many of their tools. He'd even done some work pulling away that strange armor, and understanding the anatomy of their new would-be masters. Marcus shivered, remembering the sound that last thing had made as it succumbed to whatever had taken all of its kind. Marcus and Hobe had worked as puppeteers after that, lifting and positioning the dead invaders' hands. It turned out they used the tentacles sprouting from their wrists like dew claws to twist the 2 and sometimes 3 rings inset in handles of weapons and tools. Damned awkward arrangement for even the most nimble human with 2 hands to duplicate. Dr. Grace had smushed Hobe's cheeks together and kissed him full on the mouth when the engineer strung together that first set of cogs to do the twisting for him. Marcus stifled a laugh, recalling Hobe's stunned expression at that. Truly, wondrous, amazing times. Hobe wiped his hands on the back of his neck with a rag, and then tossed it into the metal toolkit on the ground at his feet. "Be mighty glad to shake loose of this place." Marcus heard Hobe's fear, closer to the surface than either man had let it come in some time. He wondered, too, what had happened to their hometown of Dartmouth and their friends in Nova Scotia. What had happened to Marcus's family, of which Hobe was an unofficial member. What had happened to Marcus's wife Samantha and his son Robert. Marcus wasn't quite ready to open the box where he kept those fears. Instead, he looked back on how he would miss the daily miracles here, although in recent days he'd been kept away from them too. About that sudden sharp betrayal, Marcus was angriest with himself. A black man had no cause to be surprised when the looks cast his way reverted from respect to disdain, and that had happened again here. New arrivals took the meaningful work of tearing apart the alien machines and weapons. Marcus and Hobe were reduced again to foraging. Their quarters moved outside of the military compound, then back to town, then back aboard Pegasus. And finally Barton had sent the note. Pegasus was free to leave. There was some vague apology for the growing rudeness among the swelling staff of Folkestone and the project, and the Colonel's thanks for their good work, and his honest well-wishes. "It's clear sailing, Cap," Hobe said, then tossed his spanner into the toolkit and hefted it off the deck. "Let's haul anchor. I've laid up a few cases of the local brew, and that's all I care to remember of our stuffy hosts and Queen Vicky." Marcus heard the regret in Hobe's voice beneath all the bluster. Hobe had found something here that only Marcus and Pegasus had offered him before. A place to belong. Well, that's gone too, Marcus thought. Now, better men had arrived. He snorted at the thought. Better men. Scots were known as the best naval engineers in all the world, but he'd take Hobe over any of them all day long and any day. Any day, save perhaps when the Canadian was cursing the Queen aloud on the deck. "You're a poor excuse for your country. She's your queen, too. Besides, we needed to pitch in. It's a war, and we needed to help." Hobe stood and scowled, but didn't directly deny the charge. "'Tain't a war exactly, Marcus. A war's when one country wants what their neighbors got tucked away tight. Fighting these buggers? Don't know what you'd rightly call your duty." Amazing what you could get used to, really. The alien invaders had appeared to rain fire upon the cities of the world just a year past, and despite the newness of it all, he was still comfortable enough with them to use their existence to push Hobe's buttons. "They're killing all of us, aren't they?" Marcus continued. "We're lucky we were in this harbor, not on open water when the rocks started down. They held up Pegasus because supplies are tight and seagoing ships are rare. Sure, and you see why the Navy might be a bit heavy-handed about it." Hobe reached down for the jar he was drinking from. "I don't see," he said, and drained it. "Not a whit. At least they brew good. For Europeans," he muttered. Marcus grinned, enjoying the familiar sparring match, especially once talk turned to brew. As an engineer and as a Canadian, Hobe could drink any of his Scottish opposites under the table. Many had fallen before Hobe, trying to save their national pride. "Gol darn cowards," Hobe growled, "sitting up there and taking pot shots." The invasion from the stars had begun at the end of February. Metal giants had poured forth, first from cylinders falling from the skies, and then from the floating cities that came after. They strode high above the world like the conquerors they were, but their reign did not last 3 weeks before they began their retreat. Their flying cities crashed to the earth and burned. Their metal machines were left where they fell, full of strange, rotting bodies. They retreated on giant cannonballs, riding pillars of light back into the heavens. Dr. Grace had called them rocket ships. Marcus had dared to hope the world would go all the way back to normal, with their would-be overlords on the run. You'd think a man born a slave would know better. News soon came of bands of brigands with alien gadgets fighting the army for control of London. Soon the battle for London was on again, between the flags of Britain and the skull and crossbones, or the flags of self-made rulers. And then those pirates and brigands were making their own foraging runs farther and farther into the countryside. A more familiar villain now feasted on the bones of those alien invaders, quickly growing fat and powerful. Only now, after months fearing attack from those marauders, were Her Majesty's forces making strides to reclaim London and the Commonwealth. But the seas and the foreign lands of the Empire were lost to Victoria. That empire, above which the sun had never set, was now dead and gone. Marcus had fought the marauders away from Folkestone a couple of times, sweating buckets as he tried to sweet-talk battered alien tools back to life, to fend off the killers and the thieves. Then the rocks began to fall, and even the villains went to ground. Meteors, Dr. Grace called them. Bloody great rocks that turned the sea to steam or shattered the land worse than the greatest explosions man had ever made. Now, in April, the 9th month of the Blitz, as one of the German scientists had named it, there was still no end in sight. Unless the chaps in the tunnel were really ready this time. A part of him would be sorry to miss that show, after all his work setting it up. He looked back to Hobe, who was staring at him. "I think you liked it," he said. Hobe took another long gulp from his jar. Marcus frowned, wondering when he'd had time to refill it, but it was like Hobe to have a supply always on tap. Besides, it was afternoon, and his engineer was a big boy. And Hobe was right. He did miss what was going on far beneath his feet in that tunnel, dug with the large metal arms of the walking machines. Sure, the Allies were on a fool's errand with their ever-so-secret project. It was suicide, he had no doubt. But just walking around was that, these days. Marcus snorted. So was sailing for home. But he didn't care. Halifax. Samantha. Robert. Marcus tugged his cap back on, pulling it down over his eyes with a firmness that mirrored his commitment to leaving, come hell or high water or both. "I'd like to get us back home, that's what I'd like." "I got no doubt," Hobe said, changing his tune abruptly. "But leastways we helped get the prigs up to speed before a rock stomped them all flat." Marcus didn't argue. It had been a good feeling finding himself stranded, with one of the few army forces left on the planet, and finding his ability to tinker useful in reverse engineering the invaders' weapons and ships and suits, instead of racing for home, eking another 10 knots or 10 months of life out of the steam engines on the Pegasus, hoping they would not be crushed or burned by a metal walking machine or a flying ship. But that was over now. The world may well have been turned upside down, twice, by grisly beings from another planet and pirates from their own, but a black man was still a black man. The British had been serious about killing the slave trade before the invasion, but when it came to their lofty works, black man meant low man on the totem pole. 2 decades and some he'd been free now, but Marcus still felt his face harden as he considered the speed and callousness of his dismissal. The last note from Colonel Barton releasing them had fallen on him as rough as the word slave had back in the bad days. It had come just the night before, on the heels of the surprise arrival of another team of soldiers and their precious cargo, refugee scientists from mainland Europe. Well, they ought to enjoy Dr. Grace's company, he thought, imagining their faces when the newly arrived great men were introduced to the genius, unquestionably running the show. He'd miss that strange, bent and brilliant doctor. But Halifax, Samantha, Robert. "Been good, but time to go," Hobe said, echoing his thoughts. Marcus agreed with a nod and a bump of his fist atop the cloth-covered souvenir of his time working with the Allied scientists. Taking payment for their work from the skeletons of uncrewed ships in dry dock here at Folkestone, Pegasus was now in better shape than she'd been since they'd bought her. And now she has a bite, too, Marcus thought, staring at the shape under the cloth. Hobe's smile showed teeth. Just let those pirates try. Marcus still hoped they wouldn't. "All right, then, whose turn is it to weigh anchor?" Hobe opened his mouth to answer, but the twinkle in his eyes died before the first sound made it out. And when it came, that sound was shit. "Pegasus!" boomed a deep voice. "In the name of Queen Victoria, you are commanded to welcome her officers aboard." Marcus turned slowly, hands open and at his sides. Black men had been shot on the docks since all this had started. It wouldn't do to be shot on your own boat, he thought, as he looked at the 5 men standing at the far end of the gangplank up to his boat. Burly young officer carrying a Royal Navy standard. 4 riflemen were lined up on the dock behind him, their weapons shouldered, but their looks hard. The entire complement wore white pith helmets, instead of the green and brown ones preferred by those who'd fought the invaders and learned the hard way. "Great. White hats," Hobe whispered. "No good's coming of this." The engineer skirted around the device freshly bolted onto the Pegasus deck and bodily blocked it from the view of the eyes of the Navy rats. "I think they know that we've got—" Marcus shrugged. "Let's find out." Marcus was pleasantly surprised when Lieutenant Owen Burns, owner of the booming voice, an officer in his mid-20s if that, leaped across to Pegasus on his own, opting to leave his guardsmen on the dock. Hobe couldn't stop stealing glances at the cloth-covered device, so Marcus led the men into the wheelhouse and offered him tea. After the tea was served and pleasantries exchanged, Lieutenant Burns began, "Terribly sorry about this, Captain Riggs, Mr. Martin." And he was. A blush covered the young man's face from his button-down collar clear up to his curly, overlong brown hair. Even Hobe relaxed enough to lean against a bulkhead with a cup and temporarily bench his scowl. That the officer had accepted a cuppa put Marcus somewhat at ease, but he knew he'd be a damn sight more at ease once Pegasus cleared the mouth of the harbor and Hobe raised the masts for home. "I've been assigned to the harbor since my arrival, but have been given a brief on the goings-on in the mouse hole and of your contributions, sirs." Lieutenant Burns looked up from his teacup guiltily. "I understand you've been given leave to return to the Americas. However, Lieutenant Colonel Merry, my commanding officer, insists your ship be searched." Barton outranked this Lieutenant Colonel Merry. Maybe he could stall this and get Colonel Barton to step in on his behalf. "Why us?" Hobe stormed. "We done everything you asked, right till you kicked us off your pretty little secret base, and you got no right to—" Marcus held up a hand. Hobe growled, but snapped his jaws shut. "Lieutenant, Washington's dug up their own bits and bobs. They confirmed that on the cross-Atlantic ether calls, before the pirates blocked those. Our holds are clear, save for fuel and provisions. You can go and look. It's been a year away from home. All I want
Lieutenant Burns!"
Hobe craned his head out the door. Something turned his face ugly, and he shot out of the wheelroom.
"Get your hands off that! You've no right!"
The sounds of rifle bolts chilled Marcus's blood. He and Lieutenant Burns stared at each other, each wanting to follow, but Marcus knew they were both taking care not to be rash, not to pour kerosene on this fire. Eyes locked on each other, Marcus saw a surprising amount of steel in the young man's gaze. So not just young and bluster, he thought, ignoring the powder keg in his guts as his friend continued to shout to the other soldiers. "You men!" Burns barked over his shoulder.
"Lower your guns!"
Marcus felt blood pounding in his ears as he edged by Burns and looked out the door. Hobe was pushed up against the steam funnel, arms raised above his head. The rifles of 2 soldiers were still trained on him, while 2 more had pulled the cloth off the new addition to the Pegasus's deck, revealing eerie purple boxes and dark green metal tubes and wiring that made up the bulk of the weapon. At its back, the smooth original lines of the device were marred by a box of cogs and a trigger made for human hands by Hobe himself. "Well, what have we here?" drawled a tall, thin soldier with a rotten-toothed smile. He patted the invader weapon like a hunter pats the carcass of his kill. Then Marcus watched in horror as he drew his sidearm. "Thieving invader guns! That's a capital crime," he said, and pointed the barrel at Hobe's forehead. Hobe's fingers splayed as he pushed his hands higher into the air. "I ain't got no gun!" he yelled at the soldier. "Stop!" Marcus shouted. His eyes darted between each of the lieutenant's men, each angry set of eyes daring him to act if he moved. He was sure they'd cut him down too. He turned back to the lieutenant, eyes pleading. "Say hello to the angels, mate." His jagged yellow smile widened as he took careful aim and cocked the hammer. You have been listening to Asunder, the first in a series of tales after the War of the Worlds. For more information, please visit servingworlds.com. Music, Ibrido Umano by Dano, available at danosongs.com. Title image, War of the Worlds by Adam Blakemore. Learn more about Adam's artwork at blakey00.deviantart.com. Thank you for listening.